Hello everybody, welcome back to the Atypical Engineer channel. My name is Greg and today we are learning about stateful components in React. This is an extremely important feature and because components have state built into them, it allows you to basically encapsulate all of their logic into just your component code and hide your information from your parents and children, which basically makes it so that you can write independent modules and what makes React so cool. So local state inside components is super important. That's what we're talking about today. A quick overview of what we'll be covering. Just to warn you, this is part one of a two-part video series about local state in React components. That means that there'll be another video immediately after this one on this playlist covering more advanced topics. In this video, we're just going to do the following. Number one, we will talk about the concept of component state in React and three main things that I want you to take away from this series of two videos. Number two, we'll take a look at the source code that we've been working with throughout the Pokedex project, and we'll take a component that is written as a function and we'll turn it into a class-based component, which is how we're able to use local state. Number three, we'll initialize that local state in your class component. And number four, we'll use that state in code and pass it as props to another component. So another component will use the value that we store in our state. And I think it's worth mentioning what we are going to cover in video two, just in case you're specifically looking for that information. So in video two, we'll be adding an input component, so a little input box that you can type into. And then we will use our state to maintain the value inside that input box. So in video two, we'll learn how to set the state programmatically. In this video, you'll learn how to initialize the state. In the second video, you'll learn how to change the state. Of course, the code that we write in this video and in the next video is going to be reused in the final project. You can see the result of what we'll be writing in these two videos here. It's just a little text box where when you type in the input, the output of what you type is reflected both in the input box and in the header up at the top. And then we're going to work this into the final project because the final project involves typing in the name of a Pokemon into an input box and then a searchable database of the Pokemon where it gets retrieved from an external API when we click on it. But we're not going to get all the way there today. Today we are just focusing on concepts and building one small piece of this final project. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. As usual, I like to start these videos off with a little bit of conceptual background about what we'll be covering today. So let's go ahead and get started with that. There are three main concepts related to state that we're going to talk about today and that I want you to leave understanding. The first one is that local state is private to the component. The second one is that parents and children aren't aware of the local state. And the third one is that your component is re-rendered every time there's a state change. Now, when I say local state is private to a component, what does that actually mean? Well, what that means is that the state that your component manages, its local state, is exactly that. It's local. Nobody else knows that it's even being managed, and quite frankly, they don't even know whether it exists or not. So this is the first key thing to understand, which is that you can mask the complexity of your component by storing local state, and your parent doesn't even really know about it. It's all internal to your component. And that leads us right into the second bullet point, which is that your parents and children don't know about the existence of your internal state. This is kind of a funny one because oftentimes you'll tell your parents and children, and especially your children components, about values inside your state. But when you tell these components, these other components about the values in your state, they don't actually know it's coming from your state. They just know that you're giving it one specific value. And the fact that that value is stored internally in your local state is actually irrelevant to them. They don't care where that value comes from. They just know they're getting some value. And they might have their own internal state where they're storing information that helps them process that data, but you don't know about that. That's, again, the beauty of using components. So these two facts are inherently related. The fact that your internal state is local to you and you manage it as a component, and the fact that the parent and the child don't really know that it exists or know what's going on underneath the hood. They might get data, they may get past data that's stored in your state, but they don't know it's coming from your state. The third one here is that your component will re-render every time your internal state is updated. And we'll see that when we add internal state to our component in the Pokedex app. But essentially what that means is that React is smart enough to know that when you update your internal state explicitly, then it will call the render function again. We'll add a render function later in this tutorial, but it will render the component again in order to update all of the stuff on the screen with the latest data. So React wants to keep the data on the screen as fresh as possible. Part of doing that is re-rendering a component when you update state. So here are the three concepts. Again, the local state is private, internal to the component. The parent and the children don't know about the local state, and the component will re-render every time the state is updated. So these are the three conceptual takeaways we need to take. Let's go ahead and bring those forward into a coding exercise, which is what we're going to do right now. Kicking off the coding exercise, we've got the app.js file that we left off with in the previous video. And in that app.js file, we still have a function called app. And we have the Pokedex header, and the last video was to create this header component using React Semantic UI. So here's where we're at in the code. And if you go over to the project, here's where we're at in the project. So we have a header that has a little image on it, and then just a heading and a little subheading down at the bottom. Now let's go back to the code. And first we're just going to make this into what we call a component class. And a component class is a way to declare a component that basically allows you to use internal state. I think that's like the most detail that I want to go into now. So the first thing you'll do is you'll go to this line 5 and you'll call class app extends react.component, and you can delete the function app open parentheses close parentheses line. And this will basically declare your component as a class component. This doesn't work right out of the box. The first thing that you need to do is that you need to create a render function. So all of your component classes need to have a render function that has some kind of return statement, and that return statement returns some kind of JSX. Essentially what you were returning in your previous function, you want to return that in your render function. Okay, so I'll go here, I will create a render function. I'll change around all of the formatting, and now I will save. And when I go back to, after I save, when I go back to the project, we're going to see that I have the exact same information. So now this component class now calls the render function, and that render function is returning the JSX that renders what we want. So this is the first step to creating a class. You need a class to have local internal state. Unless you're using hooks. Hooks are a more advanced concept, though. We won't cover that. So let's move on. Now that we have this, we can start to add the local state. Creating the local state is actually really easy because there's a whole bunch of mechanisms built in for you to do that. The first thing that we'll need to do is to implement a constructor. If you're familiar with other object-oriented programming languages, then constructors should be a familiar term for you. In a React component, a constructor is called before the component is mounted, which is basically right at the beginning, and it's only called once. Typically, a constructor in React is used for two things, and we're going to use it for both of those things in this video. The first one is to set up and initialize some local state by setting some value to a variable called this.state. And the second one is to bind event handling methods to your component. We'll talk about bindings in the second video on component state. But for now, we just need to know that we need the constructor. So let's go ahead and add a constructor with props as the argument. And this props is going to be basically the arguments into this component, or the props. So if you imagine the Pokedex header, if you look at the Pokedex header and you imagine what the props will be, there will be an object that has a key of author and a value of @atypicalengineer, and then another key of name and a value of Greg. And that's what the props into Pokedex header will be. So every time you make a constructor, you need to initialize it with this props as an argument, and then you call a function called super on the props, which is basically calling React.components version of the constructor on these props. If you don't do that, then this .props, which is how you'll access the props in the constructor, won't be defined, which can lead to problems for you. Once you add the super line, we can go ahead and create our internal state, which is called a variable called this.state. So here you're initializing this object that contains data that will be a part of your internal state. And this is basically it. So now you've initialized state and you can use it in the rest of your component. It's really that easy. We can do this by just going down to the Pokedex header, and instead of passing my name Greg into the component as name, we'll pass something called this.state.name. Okay, and now anything that you put into the name field of state up in the constructor, we'll pass that into the Pokedex header. Okay, so if we go ahead and split up the windows, and then we do a little bit of reformatting just to make it look nicer, and then we save the file, we see on the reload that we're now actually seeing the name that you have in state passed into the Pokedex header. Okay, so this is awesome. Now you have your own local state. You can change it back to Greg, and you can save, and now that you see that the name in the header again is Greg. So here we've created our internal state. We've created a variable inside that state, and we're passing it into a separate component. This is basically how local component state works. This is the gist of it. You have a state, and then you use that, and you maintain that information, and you pass that into other components or use it to make calculations. But the obvious question is, how do you update this state? That question is reserved for the very next video in this series. I split the two videos up because they're very long. So instead, we are going to go ahead and commit the changes that we made to our GitHub account, and then we'll wrap this video up and you can move straight on to the next one. The link will be in this video. With that being said, let's go over to the GitHub desktop, and as usual, we will just inspect the code that we wrote before we go ahead and make a commit. And there's not really a lot here, but we are just seeing that we changed the app function component into a class component. We added a constructor method that takes props as an input and initializes the local state of the component. And then we passed a piece of that state, the only piece of that state, into one of our children components using the this.state.name. So let's go ahead and go down to the little commit summary, and in the commit summary, we're just going to write something brief. So changed app component to a class component, and then in our description, we'll say made app component a class component, added a constructor to initialize state, and pass that state into a child component, and then we will commit this to our master branch. And once that's done, we can go over and push this to our origin. So very nice work. In this video, we talked about the concept of stateful components. We talked about how to change your function components into state components. And we added a constructor and initialized the state, and then used that state to pass data to a child component. So in the next video, we're actually going to add an input field, and we're going to update state dynamically and show how a component actually manages its own internal state. So make sure you click through this next video. This is where the real fun happens. And thank you so much for watching. I will see you next time.